Prince William frees Camilla's royal funds after Andrew Parker Bowles reveals what he kept hidden. The order came without warning, and it came without a name attached to it that anyone inside Camilla's household had been expecting to see. No meeting had been scheduled to precede it. No conversation had been logged in any official record that her office could subsequently locate and trace backward to find the moment when the decision had first been made. No member of her staff, not her private secretary, not the senior administrator who managed the day-to-day logistics of her diary, not the woman who had served as her personal assistant for 11 years and who prided herself on knowing, at virtually any moment, what was coming before it arrived had received so much as a preliminary signal that anything was being set in motion. And yet, on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday morning, at a time when the palace was moving through its ordinary rhythms with the particular efficiency of a household that has been performing its institutional functions for centuries and has long since stopped noticing how practiced the performance has become, the financial infrastructure that supported the entire operation of a queen consort's office stopped moving. Not gradually, not with the stuttering irregularity that might have suggested a technical problem, a processing error, a bureaucratic misalignment of the kind that large institutions produce routinely and correct without ceremony. It stopped as completely and as immediately as if someone had reached into the machinery and removed a single piece that everything else depended on. The authorization line on the memorandum that followed bore a name that no one in Camilla's household had anticipated seeing in that position. It belonged to the office of the Prince of Wales. William had signed it. Those inside the palace, who understood what that meant, and there were enough of them, distributed across enough departments, that the understanding moved quickly through the building in the way that significant things always move through institutions that have spent generations learning to communicate without speaking directly went very quiet, very quickly. The silence that settled across the corridors by 9 o'clock that morning was not the ordinary silence of a household at work. It was the specific silence that large institutions produce when something genuinely significant has happened and no one has yet been authorized to say what it is, but everyone who matters already knows. What none of them yet understood, not the administrators processing the implications of the memorandum, not the staff sitting in anterooms waiting for instructions that would not come, not the senior officials exchanging careful glances across their desks, was that the sequence of events producing this moment had not begun inside the palace at all. It had begun 6 weeks earlier, in a private house in the English countryside, in a room where no record was kept and no witness was present, between a king and the man his wife had once been married to. Before we continue, subscribe now, because what Andrew Parker Bowles chose to carry into that room, and the decision he made about what to do with it, and the chain of consequences that decision set in motion inside one of the most closely watched families in the world, none of it ends where it appears to end. And what comes next may change everything you think you already understand about how power actually moves inside that palace. But to understand why William acted with the particular finality that he did, we have to return to the moment the sequence truly began. Not to any room inside the palace. Not to any official meeting, any formal exchange, any conversation that passed through the channels that royal households use to manage the movement of sensitive information between their principals. We have to return to a Wednesday afternoon, several weeks before anyone inside those walls understood that anything was coming, and to a man who had spent years deciding whether to say what he knew and had finally decided that the cost of continued silence had become greater than the cost of speaking. Andrew Parker Bowles had not arrived at this decision quickly. Those who knew him well, and they were fewer in number than his decades of proximity to royal life might have suggested, because he had always been a man who understood that the most durable form of influence in the world he inhabited was cultivated through useful distance rather than obvious closeness, described him consistently as someone who moved at the pace of a person who understood that timing was not incidental to a decision. Timing was the decision. The right information delivered at the wrong moment could cost more than saying nothing at all, and he had spent enough years watching the consequences of poorly timed revelations to have internalized that understanding completely. He had occupied a specific and carefully managed position in the landscape of royal coverage for many years. The former husband, The man who had been married to the woman the king loved, who had navigated that situation with a composure that observers had variously described as dignity, self-possession, and less charitably, in corners where less charitable observations were permitted, a calculated assessment of what equanimity was worth to someone whose social world overlapped so substantially with the world of the people he might otherwise have resented. He had appeared at the right occasions. He had said the right things, or more precisely had said nothing at all when saying nothing was the right thing. He had managed his complicated position in the story with the practiced ease of someone who had been born into a class that treats the management of complicated positions as a basic social competency. What changed was not a single event. It was an accumulation. A gradual shifting of weight across a period that people close to him placed it somewhere between 18 months and 2 years, during which something he had been carrying, something he had made the decision, years earlier, to carry quietly and alone and without placing it anywhere that might require anyone else to bear its consequences, became too heavy to continue carrying in that way. The specific nature of what had changed in his assessment of the situation remained his own private knowledge, but the effect of that change was visible to the small number of people who knew him well enough to notice. A man who had spent years at the comfortable periphery of a complicated story had decided, at last, that he could no longer remain there. He chose the king, not Camilla, not William, not any of the intermediary figures who populated the world between private knowledge and institutional consequence. He chose Charles directly, and he chose to reach him through a channel that would leave no official trace of the reaching a retired equerry who had spent the better part of 3 decades in and around royal service, who knew both households with the depth of understanding that only long proximity produces, and whose name would have meant nothing to the public but carried, in the relevant circles, the specific weight of someone who had never given anyone a reason to doubt him. The message the equerry carried was simple. Andrew Parker Bowles was requesting a private audience with the king. No staff, no official diary entry, no record of the conversation beyond whatever the 2 men chose to carry away from it themselves. Charles agreed to the meeting. Those who learned of the agreement afterward, and very few did, because the channel through which it had been arranged was precisely the kind of channel designed to limit subsequent knowledge, described his response as something between reluctant acceptance and the specific recognition of inevitability that a man arrives at when he understands that a conversation is going to happen regardless of whether he meets it directly. Andrew had made the request in a way that communicated clearly that he was not making it casually. Whatever he had decided to bring to this meeting, he had been living with it long enough to know its weight precisely. And Charles, reading that clearly enough, had understood that the only question was whether he received it on his own terms or waited for it to find him on someone else's. The house where they met was not connected to either man's official life in any traceable way. A private address in the countryside, made available through the quiet generosity that old networks extend without requiring discussion or acknowledgement or any form of gratitude that might subsequently need to be repaid. The retired equerry's own property, offered for the purpose with the particular discretion of someone who understood that the greatest service he could perform in this moment was to provide a space and then make himself entirely absent from it. The 2 men had known each other for decades. Not closely, their relationship had never been the kind that produces genuine intimacy, and the specific circumstances of their shared connection to Camilla had created a dynamic that both of them had managed, across years of encounters at military functions and country occasions and the various formal gatherings that brought their world together repeatedly, with the practiced ease of men who have each made a private peace with a situation neither of them chose. There was no hostility between them. There had never been hostility between them, which had always struck outside observers as either admirable or deeply strange depending on the observer's assumptions about human nature. There was instead a specific kind of not closeness, the variety that 2 men arrive at when they have both, in their different ways, accepted the same complicated reality, and decided that the most useful response to it was a mutual and unspoken agreement not to make it more complicated than it already was. This meeting was different from every previous encounter. What Andrew said during the hours they spent in that private sitting room remained, afterward, entirely between them. No account of the specific content of the conversation has been confirmed by anyone connected to either man. What has been described by the handful of people positioned closely enough to observe anything in the days that followed is what Charles looked like when he returned to the palace that evening. Not shaken. Not visibly disturbed in any of the ways that word typically implies. Something more specific and, in many ways, more difficult to witness than conventional distress. The expression of a man who has received information that he partly already knew, who has been living, perhaps for a long time, with the faint outline of something he could not quite see clearly, and who has just had that outline filled in with a precision that makes it impossible to continue treating it as an outline. The look of someone who has understood, on the drive home, that the part he didn't know was the part that had always mattered most. He canceled dinner that evening. A small thing, easily explained, producing no ripple in the official record. A king's schedule shifts constantly, and no one who received the brief message from his private secretary would have read anything into it without context. But those who knew his habits, the small number of people close enough to know them in any genuine sense, understood that the evening meal, taken privately but consistently, with at least one member of staff in attendance, was the one unbroken rhythm in a life that public service had otherwise made unpredictable. He had not canceled it in recent memory. He canceled it that night, and he spent the hours that followed sitting with what Andrew had placed before him, entirely alone, in the way that a man sits with something when he knows that no conversation he could have before morning will help him decide what it means. Charles did not summon Camilla through official channels. There was no message passed through a private secretary, no entry added to the official diary, no formal notation of the kind that transforms even the most intimate exchange between senior members of a royal household into an institutional record that will be filed, archived, and potentially surfaced years later by someone with the right access and the wrong intentions. He sent word instead through a single member of staff, a person given nothing to write down, carrying only the information that the king wished to speak with her that afternoon and that she should come when she was able. The informality of this was itself a signal, and she read it. In a household where the most private conversations between its principals move through at least one layer of administrative structure, where even a request to share a meal carries with it a trail of correspondence that will outlast the meal itself, the absence of that structure communicated something that no accompanying message could have expressed more clearly. Whatever Charles needed to say to her, he had decided that the institutional machinery could not be part of the room while he said it. She came within the hour. The sitting room he had chosen was one they both knew well, a smaller room on the upper floor of the private residence, used across the years of their marriage for conversations that required distance from the working areas of the household, from the desks and the staff, and the accumulated bureaucratic weight of official life. A room without the furniture of authority. No desk positioned to establish power, no arrangement of chairs designed to manage the dynamic between two people, none of the architectural grammar of institutional life that royal residences deploy, often unconsciously, to remind the people moving through them of the relationships between them. Just a room, two people, and a document on the low table between them that Charles had placed there before she arrived and had not touched since. Camilla looked at the document before she looked at him. It was a single sheet, a photocopy, not an original, bearing a date from the years immediately following her divorce from Andrew. Years before her relationship with Charles had acquired any formal dimension. Years before the world had begun watching her in the way that transforms everything a person has ever done into potential evidence of who they are. The contents, as Charles had understood them from Andrew's account, and from his own reading of the document in the days since the meeting in the countryside, described a private financial arrangement entered into during that period. Specifically, an agreement, documented in writing, that suggested she had used knowledge acquired through her proximity to royal circles during her years as the wife of a senior military figure to leverage a private negotiation. Knowledge she had possessed, no official standing to hold, no formal connection to the institution that had produced it. Knowledge that had come to her, in the way that knowledge comes to people who spend enough years moving through powerful circles simply by being present in the right rooms at the right moments, and that she had, on this account, chosen to use in a context where the people on the other side of the negotiation had no way of knowing its source or its significance. The arrangement was not, in isolation, a matter with legal consequence. It was something more difficult to manage than a legal matter. It was a question of judgment of the kind of person a woman had been willing to be, in a moment when no one was watching, in the years before the world began watching her very closely indeed. And it was a question whose answer, in the hands of anyone with the context to understand what the document described, told a story that could not easily be separated from the story of who she had since become. Charles asked her a single question, not delivered as an accusation, not shaped with the bluntness of someone who has already decided what the answer means, shaped instead with the careful precision of a man who has spent 6 weeks deciding exactly how to hold what he has been given and who understands that the way he asks this question will determine everything about what follows it. He asked her to help him understand what the arrangement had been. The silence that followed lasted long enough to become a kind of answer in itself. Those who have subsequently described the atmosphere of that room, and they are few, and their accounts are second-hand, filtered through the careful language of people who were not present but who spoke afterward to people who were describe it as the silence of a conversation that both participants understood was no longer about the document on the table. The document was simply the occasion for the conversation. What the conversation was actually about was something that had existed between them in one form or another, for a very long time, something that had never been placed directly into words because placing it into words would have required both of them to acknowledge that the words had always been available and that they had been choosing, together, not to speak them. When Camilla finally spoke, she did not challenge the document. She did not question its authenticity, did not suggest that its contents had been fabricated, did not propose that Andrew had constructed something false from fragments of something true. She offered instead a reframing a context she said the document lacked, a characterization of the arrangement that she said had been distorted by the absence of everything that had surrounded it. The knowledge she had used, she told him, was nothing more than the ordinary accumulation of two people who had spent years moving through the same world. What appeared on the page as leverage was, in her account, nothing more than a private negotiation between two people attempting to untangle the shared architecture of a dissolved marriage using the materials they had available to them at the time. Nothing had been taken that had not also, in some sense, been offered. Charles listened to all of it without interrupting, and when she finished, he did not respond to what she had said. He asked her instead about Andrew. He asked specifically whether she had any understanding of why Andrew had chosen to bring this forward now at this particular moment, after so many years during which he had clearly possessed this information and had made a repeated ongoing decision not to use it. What had changed in his calculation? What the present moment offered that the preceding years had not? The question settled into the room between them. And Camilla, who had spent decades developing an extraordinarily precise understanding of the terrain between what is said and what is meant inside this family, who had navigated that terrain across situations that would have defeated people with less developed instincts for it, gave the one response that told Charles everything the document alone had left uncertain. She did not say that what Andrew had shown him was untrue. She asked why he would do this to her. William had been informed before the memorandum was distributed, not notified after the decision had been made, not briefed as a courtesy extended to the heir apparent in the interest of keeping him oriented to significant developments within the household. Informed present in the conversation from which the decision emerged, his office included in the authorization chain from the beginning, his name appearing in a position that placed him not as an observer of what was being set in motion, but as a participant in directing it. The keeper of the privy purse, who had administered royal finances across a tenure long enough to have developed a precise and comprehensive understanding of what precedent looked like and what departing from it signified, understood immediately what William's position in that chain meant. In 2 decades of service, he had not encountered a situation in which the Prince of Wales had occupied this role in a matter involving the Queen Consort's household finances. The precedent, as far as he could determine, did not exist. And the absence of precedent, in an institution that had spent centuries developing elaborate systems for the management of exactly these kinds of sensitive internal matters, was not an administrative oversight. It was a statement. The legal dimension was handled with equivalent precision. Senior counsel was engaged to advise specifically and deliberately not to investigate, because investigation implied a conclusion waiting to be reached. while advice implied only a desire to understand the boundaries of what the institution could and could not accomplish within its own structures. The advice, when it arrived, was characteristically precise. What had been described fell within the absolute discretion of the sovereign over the management of royal household finances. No external body was required. No public process was necessary. The institution possessed all the authority it needed to manage this matter entirely within itself. Within? That was the word that mattered. The memorandum reached Camilla's household office on a Tuesday morning, circulated through the internal correspondence system in the careful bureaucratic language of routine administrative communication language designed, as such language always is inside this institution, to communicate authority while declining to explain itself. A review of expenditure, no timeline, no context, no explanation of what had prompted it or what it was expected to produce. By 9 o'clock, the building understood that something permanent had happened. Her engagement diary shed 3 appearances across the following fortnight: a hospital visit, a reception connected to a patronage she had maintained for years, a ceremony at which she had been expected to represent the crown. The organizations involved received brief communications, citing scheduling conflicts. None of them were offered alternative dates. The staff who managed her public calendar understood without requiring explanation that a scheduling conflict producing no rescheduling was not a scheduling conflict. It was a removal. 2 members of her household office found their building access adjusted on a Monday morning. Their desks had been cleared over the preceding weekend. They were told only that they had been reassigned to support roles in other departments, a description precise enough to convey that the matter was settled and vague enough to convey that no further information would be forthcoming. Neither of them asked the question they were both holding, because the building's specific quality of silence that morning had already answered it. The accounts through which her office managed its operational expenses were placed on administrative hold. Not legally frozen. Held the distinction existed in the language of the correspondence. In practical effect, the accounts through which her office had paid its staff, arranged its travel, and managed the 100 daily requirements of a working senior royal household were inaccessible without authorization that only one office could now provide: William's office. Her correspondence tray sat outside her private rooms untouched for the 2nd consecutive morning. She had always collected her letters herself. In all the years her staff had known her working habits, in all the mornings that had preceded this one, the tray had never once been left waiting. The church service had been on the calendar for months before any of this began. A national commemoration at one of the city's older churches, the kind of occasion that exists at the precise intersection of the ceremonial and the civic, where the royal family's presence carries not merely customary weight, but constitutional weight, and where the mechanics of attendance have been managed through the same protocols for so many decades that deviation from them registers immediately to anyone with the knowledge to read them. An occasion that could not be cancelled without producing a statement, and could not be attended without producing photographs. An occasion that had become, by the morning it arrived, something other than what it had been when it was scheduled. It had become a text, and every detail of it had become language. The cars arrived in separate sequences, small, deliberate, invisible to anyone who did not know what the ordinary sequence looked like, and entirely clear to the photographers who had spent enough years covering these occasions to carry that knowledge automatically. The deviation was not dramatic. It did not produce an obvious image in isolation. It produced instead the particular alertness of people who have just noticed that something is different from what it should be, and who understand that the difference was chosen. Inside the church, the seating placed Charles and Camilla in the same row. Protocol required it, but the space between them, a space that would normally have closed in the natural way of a row filling around 2 people, as it always does at occasions of this kind, remained. No one had filled it. Whether this was the product of the seating plan arranged before the service or of some quieter decision made in the minutes before the family took their places, the effect was identical. A space, sitting in the exact center of every photograph taken from the press gallery, present in the footage from the pool camera positioned to the left of the nave, a space that required no caption, no accompanying explanation, no interpretive assistance from anyone. It said everything that the palace's single careful statement had declined to say. William sat several rows forward with Catherine. He did not look back during the service. His attention remained directed toward the altar with the focused stillness of a man who has made a decision about what this moment requires of him and is delivering on that decision with the consistency of someone who has been preparing for it. Catherine sat beside him with the expression she had spent years perfecting present, warm at precisely the moments that warmth was called for, revealing with absolute precision only what she had chosen in advance to reveal and nothing beyond it. The photograph that would circulate most widely in the hours following the service was not a confrontation. It contained no visible distress, no exchanged glance that could be analyzed for its content, no moment of human drama that gave the image its charge. It was a wide shot taken during the final hymn, the voices of a congregation presumably rising around its subjects, the occasion performing its ceremonial function with complete formal correctness. In the center of the image, between two pairs of hands resting on order of service cards, was the empty space in the pew, neither set of hands reaching toward it, neither retreating, simply existing on either side of a gap that the camera recorded with complete neutrality and the public read with complete clarity. Camilla left before the formal recession concluded. The security detail accompanying her to the car was smaller than her position would ordinarily require. The adjustment in that detail, the specific number of personnel assigned, the vehicle arranged, the exit route taken was the kind of operational change that registers as nothing to the public and as everything to the people inside the institution who understand what operational decisions about a senior royals movement and security actually communicate about how the household has reassessed that senior royals' position within it. The car moved away from the church. The service continued inside, and the photograph was already moving across every platform that carried it, saying with the simple geometry of a gap between two pairs of hands, everything that 4 weeks of careful institutional process had been designed to communicate without ever requiring anyone to say it aloud. The palace marked none of what had happened with ceremony. This was entirely consistent with how the institution had always managed its most consequential internal recalibrations, not through announcement, not through the formal acknowledgement that would create a record and invite a response, but through the gradual redistribution of small operational details that accumulate over weeks and months into a new reality, a reality that arrives so quietly and settles so completely into the texture of ordinary institutional life, that by the time anyone thinks to ask when it began, the answer has already become impossible to locate precisely. Camilla's name remained on her patronages. The organizations that had relied on her support across years of consistent engagement received no formal communication informing them that anything had changed. But the invitations that had previously arrived from the palace coordinating her presence at their events, the kind of invitations that a working senior royals office generates as a matter of institutional routine, scheduling appearances months in advance, managing the logistics of a public role with the efficiency of a professional organization, came with decreasing frequency, and then stopped coming at all. The organizations adapted. As organizations do when the institutional support sustaining a relationship quietly withdraws without drama, without explanation, without any mechanism through which a formal objection could be lodged, they adjusted their programs, redirected their correspondence, and continued their work in the way that practical people continue their work when the conditions around them change and explanation is not on offer. Andrew Parker Bowles returned to the periphery. His name had circulated for several weeks, carried by the momentum of public curiosity and the media's structural need to attach a story to a human sequence of cause and effect that can be followed from beginning to end. The follow-up coverage that connected his name to the sequence of events inside the palace had given him, briefly, a prominence he had not sought and did not appear to find comfortable. And then the coverage moved on, as it always does, to the next story, and he returned to the position he had always occupied in the landscape of this family's public life. Present in the historical record, absent from the present conversation, having made his decision and delivered its consequences to the people, better positioned than he was to determine what those consequences would produce. Charles carried what he was carrying the way he had always carried the most difficult things, invisibly to anyone who was not watching closely, and with complete transparency to anyone who was. His public schedule continued without interruption. His engagements, his speeches, his ceremonial functions, The 100 daily requirements of a working sovereign, all of it proceeded with the consistency that the role demanded and that he had spent his entire life training himself to provide, regardless of what was happening beneath the choir. Surface of the day. Those who worked most closely with him observed only that the particular quality of presence he had always brought to private conversation, a quality of genuine attention, of real engagement with the specific person in front of him, was somewhat diminished in the months that followed. Not absent, diminished. The difference, visible only to those who had known what it looked like at its full measure, between a man entirely present and a man present enough. William said nothing publicly. He did not need to. The authority he carried inside the institution after this sequence of events was not the authority of someone who had prevailed in a conflict. It was something quieter than that, and considerably more durable, the authority of someone who had been measured against a decision that carried genuine cost at every level and had not moved. Who had understood what the decision would require and had met that requirement completely, without visible effort and without seeking acknowledgement. That kind of authority does not announce itself. It simply exists, and the people around it orient to it, and the orientation becomes the new geography of the institution, and the moment that produced it gradually recedes into the long, complicated history of a family that has spent generations demonstrating that its most permanent changes are the ones that were never required to explain themselves. What remained, when the immediate noise had settled and the newspapers had carried the story as far as it would carry and returned to their ordinary rotation of concerns, was something that resisted the clean categories that institutions prefer to apply to their own internal transformations. Not rupture the visible, definitive break that produces a clear before and after. Not resolution, the restoration of something workable from something that had been broken, something more honest and more difficult than either of those things. The specific condition that a family arrives at when something true has finally been said into a space that had been carefully maintained for years as a space where that truth would not be spoken, and when all of them must now build whatever comes next on ground that has shifted permanently beneath them in a way that none of them chose and all of them will have to live with. The palace doors did not close behind her. That would have been too definitive, too visible, too available as a moment that could be pointed to and named. Instead, they simply opened less often. And in the particular silence that exists between one opening and the next, the silence that royal families have always used to carry what they cannot say and protect what they cannot afford to lose the distance established. Itself, the way that the most durable distances always do inside this institution, quietly, permanently, without anyone being required to confirm that it was there. What Andrew Parker Bowles knew, and why he chose this moment to stop keeping it, the answer to that question is still moving through rooms that no camera has entered. Subscribe, because this story has not finished writing itself, and the next chapter will not announce itself in advance.